The Expansion of the Federal Government Through the Commerce Clause by Jake Rudick.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
If you've been successful, you didn't get there on your own. If you got a business, that you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen.
Oppressive tyranny is what founded America. The founders of this country fought and died for their freedom, the same freedom that we are losing today. After defeating their tyrant in the Revolutionary War, why would these founding fathers create a government that rules over its people? They wanted to make sure that the United States could never become like England. In order to ensure this, they drafted the Constitution to protect the people from an oppressive and large federal government. The founders, when establishing our government, gave the states more power than the federal government. The founders wanted each state to have the power to do what it wanted. If Virginia raised its cabbage prices, then that was okay, because it was a state decision. In this case, people that normally got their cabbage from Virginia could instead get their cabbage from Connecticut, where it was cheaper. But what if the state of Virginia got mad because all of its people were ordering their cabbage from Connecticut, and then they set a large tariff on all imports from Connecticut? This would infringe on the free market. This is a problem that the founders thought about. To solve this problem, they wrote the Commerce Clause into the Constitution. The Commerce Clause was created to referee the free market. The Industrial Revolution brought thousands of Europeans to America. The U.S. went from rural farms to large cities. All of these immigrants were working in factories and had very long days. A man named Karl Marx told the people that they should get more money for less work, and thus he introduced communism to America. In 1890, the power-hungry and progressive federal government passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which opened the door to immense expansion of the federal government. The first time this act was seen by the Supreme Court was in 1895 in United States v. E.C. Knight Company. The federal government attempted to expand the definition of the Antitrust Act with this case. When the Antitrust Act was written, it gave the federal government the power to take down monopolies and create more competition in business. This power is found nowhere in the Constitution. In the E.C. Knight case, a sugar company bought out its opponents, and the federal government stepped in and tried to regulate the manufacturing of sugar. The court was deciding whether the act was constitutional, and they could have easily abolished the law, but instead, they kept the law and ruled that sugar is a necessity to life, and that manufacturing is not really considered an area that could be regulated by Congress pursuant to the Commerce Clause. The date was January 30th, 1905. A happy group of Supreme Court justices head home after a long day. They were happy because the federal government had just been expanded even further. This time the case was Swift versus United States. The federal government had gained control of a meatpacking company. The meatpacking company only sent meats to the locations in their state, and yet the federal government used the Commerce Clause to regulate this company. The court made up a new phrase that they used to back up their decision. They said the meatpacking company was part of a stream of commerce. Here's an example of their new phrase. The cow is on a farm, the cow then goes to the meatpacking plant, and then the meat goes to the grocery store, and finally it ends up on your plate. This is the new definition of interstate commerce, far from the original definition, which was to prevent states from using tariff to inhibit commerce. This decision was also tried again in Stafford v. Wallace, 1922. and the court had the same holding. The year was 1936. FDR was president, and 4 conservative justices remained on the court. These justices were known as the Four Horsemen. The Four Horsemen were able to strike down most of the New Deal, which angered FDR. Therefore, he threatened to pack the court, and the Four Horsemen were no more. They changed their vote to favor liberal and expansive bills. This was known as the switch in time that saved 9. In the 1930s, the Agricultural Adjustment Act was passed. This act allowed the federal government to regulate agriculture. This act was then seen by the Supreme Court in 1942 in the case Wickard versus Filburn. In this case, a farmer named Mr. Filburn was growing extra crops for his family to eat. According to the Agricultural Adjustment Act, he was growing too many crops, and this was illegal. Mr. Filburn was not even going to sell the crops for profit, they were just for his family. The Supreme Court found this to be constitutional, and they said that Congress had the right to do this under the Commerce Clause, and that even though these crops never crossed state lines, other farmers' crops did cross state lines. Therefore, it is constitutional. King George of England was the ruler of the 13 colonies. Any rights his subject had came from him. The founders said that was tyranny. They said all men are created equal, and a man's rights come from his creator. As for their own government, they said that the states must overpower the federal government or we would revert back to tyranny. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and Europeans emigrated to America. The population boomed, creating new opportunities and new problems in America. Charles Darwin said because living creatures mutate and adapt, therefore man was not created by God. He said man evolved from monkeys, and people were amazed. And then Karl Marx said individual freedom leads to misery, and only a collective society would protect man from the injustice of the industrialized world. He said there is no God, only the fairness of communism can decide what a man's rights will be, forcing Americans to believe that their God-given rights were given to them by their government. Up until 1937, the height of the Depression, the Supreme Court defended the Constitution by striking down any expansion that the federal government had attempted. This annoyed FDR, so he threatened to add more justices to the court if the current justices did not change their vote. They began to vote in favor of the federal government expanding. This change was called the switch in time that saved 9. The courts invented new standards not found in the Constitution for their own benefit. In the sugar case, they said that sugar was essential to man, therefore the federal government could regulate it. Also, because it crossed state lines, but only the interstate transaction of the good can be regulated, not the manufacturing. In the beef case, they said if it crossed the state line, then the government could regulate it all the way back to the farm that raised the calf. That was the end of the original Commerce Clause and the beginning of overreaching federal control. That is the turning point. The Supreme Court told a wheat farmer named Filburn he couldn't grow crops for his own family because the federal government was making all farming decisions. The federal government should do something about this. This is what Americans exclaimed whenever a state problem appeared, but in fact, they were taking the first steps to a total surrender of their liberty.
Never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before.
The Supreme Court has only one job, to judge if laws are constitutional. But what is the Constitution to them? Is it the original document and its amendments? Yes, plus anything a justice may have written in a prior decision. The Supreme Court references past case rulings as if they were the Constitution. In effect, the Supreme Court uses the Commerce Clause to rewrite the Constitution to whatever they want it to say. And that is how a document written to protect its people from a tyrant and strong federal government was defeated. A little clause put in by the founders to referee free trade among states was twisted over a series of decisions spanning 150 years to mean that the federal government has the power to regulate and decide everything for the individual. In effect, the federal government is now the one that decides what rights you will have, not God. This is the story of the bloody escape from tyranny to freedom, and now the slow, painful march back to tyranny.
Once again reminded people But man is not free unless government is limited. There's a clear cause and effect here that is as neat and predictable as a law of physics. As government expands, liberty contracts. As government expands, liberty contracts.